What's up? Welcome back to Newsweek.
Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Michael Mann is probably the most dishonest climate scientist, but Catherine Hayhoe comes in a close second. She has me and all of my followers blocked on Twitter, but she made this tweet this morning. In her tweet, she claimed that the area of the U.S. burned by wildfires every year was increasing due to climate change, and she said it in capital letters. But look where she started her graph, in 1984. And she referred to the National Climate Assessment, which she was one of the authors. Here is the key page from the final report of the National Climate Assessment. And over here on the right side is the wildfire graph, which went out to policymakers and journalists. Let's take a closer look at that. The data starts in 1983. So you're probably asking, why did they start the data in 1983? Well, I'm going to show you. This graph from the U.S. Forest Service shows burn acreage going back for 100 years. It's pretty easy to see what's going on. There was a lot more burn acreage prior to 60 years ago. And no surprise, look where Catherine Hayhoe started her graph, in 1984, right at the low point. So over here, I superimposed the National Climate Assessment graph on top of the Forest Service graph. And you can see exactly what they've done. They hit all of the years which showed that forest fire burn acreage was massively decreasing in the United States, not increasing. The pink rectangle shows all of the data that's being hidden in the National Climate Assessment and in Catherine Hayhoe's tweet. This is as bad as climate fraud gets. Now let's look at this year's burn acreage from the National Interagency Fire Center. So far this year, there's been about 4.4 million acres burned, and the fire season is just about over. The 4.4 million acres this year is third lowest in the last decade, and well below the 10-year average of 6.6 million acres. Another important fact is that the vast majority of the burn acreage this year was in Alaska. In the lower 48 states, this may have been the quietest fire year on record. Now let's place that 4.4 million number on Catherine Hayhoe's graph. You can see it's very close to the bottom. And let's look at the left side of her graph. She shows 0 burn acreage in 1984. That's really credible. On this date in 1938, the New York Times reported there was a fire every 3 minutes in 1937, which burned almost 22 million acres. Compare the 22 million acres in 1937 to the 4.4 million acres in 2019. And remember that the vast majority of the 4.4 million acres this year was in Alaska, which wasn't counted in 1937. So realistically, there was more than 10 times as much burn acreage in 1937 as there was this year. Now let's read the first paragraph of the New York Times article. Every 3 minutes on the average during 1937, a forest fire started in the United States, but this year's total of losses was considerably under that of 1936. So as bad as 1937 was, 1936 was much worse. Now let's go back even further to pre-industrial times when atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were 280 parts per million. This 2001 report from the Department of the Interior, Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, EPA, and several other agencies said, in the conterminous United States during the pre-industrial period, 1500 to 1800, an average of 145 million acres burned annually. Today, only 14 million acres are burned annually. So burn acreage is down 90% from the days when CO2 was at pre-industrial levels. And remember, they're talking about the conterminous United States. This year was probably down 99% from pre-industrial levels. I've been tracking Catherine Hayhoe for about 10 years, and this is fairly typical behavior for her. She makes scientifically unsupportable claims over and over again based on cherry-picked data. And then she goes around speaking to Christian groups and tries to frighten them with her junk science. Catherine Hayhoe is a political hack and a propagandist, not a serious scientist. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Climate scientists at NASA and NOAA have been working diligently for decades to erase inconvenient periods in Earth's history. The most recent version of NOAA's Global Historical Climatology Network has achieved some of their key goals. In this video, I'm going to go through exactly what they've done to rewrite Earth's recent history. George Orwell said, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." 45 years ago, this was the consensus view of graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research showed a lot of warming from 1880 until the 1940s, followed by sharp cooling. The post-1940s cooling was so fast that 1970 was actually cooler than 1870. And every form of bad weather was blamed on global cooling. Global cooling may be the cause of the devastating African drought now in its 6th year. Some scientists believe that expansion of the cold polar air caps pushed the monsoon rain belt southward, causing many of the life-giving rains to fall on already fertile lands or into the sea. Dry weather conditions also prevail in parts of India, China, Kenya, Bolivia, and other countries on both sides of the equator. So the bad weather was blamed on global cooling and an expanding Arctic ice cap. Now climate scientists blame bad weather on global warming and a shrinking Arctic ice cap. But note something interesting in the language in this article. It says, "Some scientists believe." That's very different language from what climate journalists use now. Current climate journalists aren't that honest. They simply say, "Scientists say," and they refuse to present any other points of view. This is a very disturbing trend in journalism. They've gone from being journalists to propagandists. This graph of Northern Hemisphere temperatures was published by the National Academy of Sciences in 1975. It showed the same thing as the NCAR graph, rapid warming until 1940 and then rapid cooling. In 1970 was no warmer than 1880. The reason people were focused on the Northern Hemisphere was explained in this 1978 article in the New York Times. January 5th, 1978. An international team of specialists has concluded from 8 indexes of climate that there is no end in sight to the cooling trend of the last 30 years, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. Data from the Southern Hemisphere, particularly south of latitude 30 south, are so meager that reliable conclusions are not possible. I've looked at the data currently being used for the Southern Hemisphere, and the vast majority of it is complete garbage. 40 years ago, climate scientists were honest enough to recognize that fact. And down at the bottom, I have highlighted another interesting paragraph. A gradual increase in area of the northern circumpolar vortex, the massive flow of frigid air around the Arctic, has been recorded by Doctors Angel and Kirshover. So 40 years ago, the polar vortex was blamed on global cooling and an expanding Arctic ice cap. Now climate scientists blame the polar vortex on global warming and a shrinking Arctic ice cap. In 1961, there was unanimous consensus that Earth was cooling. New York Times, January 30th, 1961. Scientists agree world is colder. An assembly of specialists from several continents seems to have reached unanimous agreement on only one point. It is getting colder. Pittsburgh Press, October 9th, 1974. Shifts in world climate since 1945 help explain severe food crisis. Weather records show that the annual average temperature over the Northern Hemisphere rose dramatically from about 1890 through 1945, but have been falling ever since. The total changes averaged about 1/2 degrees centigrade, with the greatest cooling in the all-important wheat-growing regions of North America and Europe. The drop has already shortened the growing season in England by 2 weeks and caused a dangerous southward shift of monsoon winds in rice-growing regions of Southeast Asia. I was living in England in 1969 and 1970 and remember the long, cold winter. This article was in National Geographic in November 1976. Just what is going on with the climate? What changes are taking place around us? From 1880 to about 1940, the world, particularly the Northern Hemisphere, went through a period of significant warming. I heard from tall, quiet-spoken Dr. J. Murray Mitchell of NOAA. He is one of the nation's most respected climatologists. He went on, but since about 1940, there has been a distinct drop in average global temperature. It's fallen about half a degree Fahrenheit, even more in the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere. England's annual growing season shrank by 9 or 10 days between 1950 and 1966, Hubert Lamb has noted. In the northern tier of the U.S. Midwest, summer frosts again occasionally damage crops. Sea ice has returned to Iceland's coast after more than 40 years of virtual absence. During the last 20 to 30 years, world temperature has fallen irregularly at first, but more sharply over the last decade. U.S. National Science Board, 1974. Glaciers in Alaska and Scandinavia have slowed the recession. Some in Switzerland have begun advancing again. There wasn't any question in the scientific community or outside of it that the Earth was cooling after 1945, and rather dramatically. The cooling was causing crops to fail. It was causing ice to block Iceland's seaports. It was very obvious that the world was cooling. The coldest 3-year period for winters on record in the United States was from 1977 through 1979. There wasn't any doubt that Earth had cooled dramatically from 1945 through about 1975, and this became very inconvenient later for climate scientists pushing the global warming agenda. So as you can see in this 2009 ClimateGate email, scientists from multiple government agencies colluded to try to get rid of the warmth of the 1940s and the subsequent cooling. From Tom Wigley at NCAR to Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia in England, copied Ben Santer of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. Phil Jones said, if you look at the attached plot, you will see that the land also shows the 1940s blip. If we could reduce the ocean blip by, say, 0.15 degrees C, then this would be significant for the global mean, but we would still have to explain the land blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip. So it's clear that they wanted to get rid of the warmth of the 1940s and the subsequent cooling, and they didn't even have an explanation for why they were going to do it. This is not science. This is collusion, manipulation, and fraud. These people wanted to influence public policy using fraudulent data. And as you can see in the most recent graph from NOAA's Global Historical Climatology Network, that's exactly what they did. The dashed line shows the unadjusted data, which still shows somewhat of a 1940s blip, but the adjusted data has almost completely removed it. This is just what climate scientists in different government agencies in different countries said they were going to do in 2009. This data tampering wasn't done all at once, though. This was 1981 graphs from NASA's James Hansen. His graph still showed a strong 1940s blip, but it wasn't as large as in the 1974 NCAR graph. And in this graph, you can see the changes which NASA made between 2001 and 2016. In 2001, NASA showed about half a degree warming from 1880 until the end of the 20th century. But by 2016, NASA had more than doubled the warming during that same period. And in the 2016 version, NASA further removed the 1940s blip and subsequent cooling. Now let's look at some other inconvenient periods which have been erased in the most recent graphs. In the 2013 IPCC report, the global warming pause after the year 2000 was central to the report. That also has been erased. There no longer is a post-2000 pause in the temperature graph. And here's another thing which has been erased. In 1989, NOAA's top climate guy said that Earth cooled from 1921 to 1979. December 7th, 1989, analysis of warming since 1881 shows most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the most recent sharp rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, said Tom Carl of NOAA. While the global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979, Carl said. Now let's look at that same period from 1921 to 1979 in the current NOAA graph. 30 years ago, NOAA said that that period cooled, but now they show 0.5 C warming during the same period. I'm pretty sure that the people who lived at the time knew better what was going on with the climate than the current people who are tampering with the data. Now let's look at something else which is being erased and hidden, the warmth of the 1870s. The blue line is the 2000 version of NASA's global temperature graph, and the red line is the 2017 version. You can see how the 2017 version has erased half a degree of warmth, which was occurring in the 1870s. This is very significant because the first few months of 1878 may have been the warmest on record. Minnesota had no winter weather during the winter of 1877 through 1878. Minneapolis Tribune, March 19, 1878, a wonderful winter. Observations on the weather have been kept at Fort Snelling since 1819. There is nothing in the memory of the living or the records of the dead that give us such a winter and spring as we have passed in the last 4 or 5 months. Indeed, we had no winter weather in Minnesota, and the first spring month thus far has been more like May than March. Meanwhile, in Australia, they were having record heat. The month of January 1878 will be long remembered by the farming community as a period of heat and drought scarcely ever known or experienced in this colony before. On Thursday, the 10th last, the heat was most intense, the thermometer registering 123 degrees in the shade and 158 degrees in the sun. There were many reports like this from all over Australia that winter. So the heat of the 1870s is also being hidden. And one more thing which is being hidden is the proxy data. Griffith's trees were removed from the temperature record by Michael Mann. This data hiding was exposed in ClimateGate emails. It became known as hiding the decline and Mike's nature trick. The excuse for removing this proxy data was that it didn't match the completely fake global temperature record. So first they tampered with the temperature data to remove the post-1940s global cooling. And then they used the tampered temperature data as an excuse to remove the post-1940s global cooling from the proxy record. That's pretty bad science and pretty blatant fraud. But the cooling after the 1940s, which has since been erased, was very real and very well documented. Science News, March 1st, 1975, the Ice Age cometh. Chicago Tribune, March 2nd, 1975, brr, new Ice Age on way soon. In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. Ice doesn't lie, but climate scientists do. New York Times, July 18, 1970. U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. Guardian, January 29, 1974. Space satellites show new ice age coming fast. New York Times, December 29, 1974. A number of climatologists point to signs both great, a steady global cooling trend since World War II, and quaint, the southward retreat from Nebraska of the warmth-loving armadillo, to support their claim that the coming years will feature colder, more erratic weather. Some recent warnings from reputable researchers in Japan, Europe, and the US have so worried policymakers that last January, certain scientists at a meeting of the National Academy of Sciences proposed the evacuation of some 6 million people from their parched homelands in the Sahel region of Africa. In 1972, 42 top American and European investigators met at Brown University and sent a letter off to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century. In 1974, the CIA reported, there is growing consensus among leading climatologists that the world is undergoing a cooling trend. If it continues as feared, it could restrict production in both the USSR and China, among other states, and could have an enormous impact not only on the food population balance, but also on the world balance of power. So you can see that NOAA has rewritten a tremendous amount of important world history. This graph is not science, it's propaganda, and it's being used in an attempt to influence policy. Your tax dollars are being used to create fraudulent graphs, which are intentionally created to influence policies which will also be used against you. These fake temperature graphs form the core of the EPA CO2 endangerment finding, which is being used to shut down the U.S. energy supply. Every American should be very concerned about what's going on with this temperature data tampering. Ayn Rand said, the hardest thing to explain is the glaringly evident which everybody had decided not to see. This climate crisis is the biggest scam in science history. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Fear of drowning is one of the favorite tools of climate alarmists. I'm going to show you in this video how NASA creates fake sea level graphs, which are then fed into fake news sources like the Washington Post. Seas are now rising faster than they have in 2,800 years, scientists say. Anytime you see the word scientists say in a news article, you can pretty much assume that everything else you're going to read in the article is a bunch of nonsense. The body of scientists holds many different opinions, and any newspaper writer who doesn't respect that fact is simply not being honest. So down at the bottom of the page, it says seas rose about 14 centimeters, 5.5 inches from 1900 to 2000. The new study suggests for a rate of 1.4 millimeters per year. The current rate, according to NASA, is 3.4 millimeters per year, suggesting that sea level rise is still accelerating. So the study claims that sea level rise has more than tripled since the year 2000. I'm going to show you now how this fraud is accomplished. But first, let's look at some of the visual propaganda which this sort of nonsense enables. The weather of the future, Manhattan underwater. The exact same propaganda from 85 years ago. Well, melting icebergs engulf the world, and there it is, Manhattan underwater. So here's the NASA data, which shows the tripling of sea level rise rates. It was actually generated by the fraudsters at the Australian CSIRO. In this graph, I annotate what they've done. From 1880 to 1940, it was 1.2 millimeters per year. From 1940 to 1990, it was 2 millimeters per year. In recent years, it's been 4 millimeters per year. So you can see how the graph is curving upwards. That indicates that sea level rise is accelerating. It sounds very convincing, except for the fact that in the 1990 IPCC report, they said there is no convincing evidence of an acceleration in global sea level rise during the 20th century. Now let's look at the NASA sea level graph from 1982. This was from a paper co-authored by NASA's James Hansen, the guy who a few years later started the global warming scare before Congress. But note how in the 1982 graph, instead of having an upwards curvature, it has a downwards curvature, indicating that sea level rise was decelerating or slowing down. In fact, the 1982 NASA graph showed essentially no sea level rise from 1950 through the mid-1970s. And here's the bottom of the 1982 paper. The sea level response to this warming should be carefully determined to aid our understanding of the processes and to allow early detection of any non-linear response. So what he meant by a nonlinear response was the curvature. In the case of the 1982 graph, it was a downwards curvature, indicating that sea level rise was slowing down. But in the case of the current NASA graph, it's an upwards curvature, indicating that sea level rise is accelerating or speeding up. Now let's look at how the 1982 NASA graph compares with the current one. You can see that NASA's made huge changes since the year 1950. They used to show after 1950 sea level rise slowing down, and now they show it speeding up after 1950. Now let's look at how they accomplished this data tampering. This graph shows all 365 NOAA global sea level tide gauges. These straight lines in this graph are the trend lines. You can see that many stations show sea level falling and others show it rising. This doesn't make a lot of sense until you think about what tide gauges do. Tide gauges are not actually measuring changes in sea level. What they're measuring is changes in sea level relative to changes in the land elevation. If the land is rising at the location of the tide gauge, then sea level will appear to be falling. And if the land at the location of the tide gauge is falling, then sea level will appear to be rising. So this should give you a hint that you can create any trend you want by cherry picking the right stations. In order to demonstrate this, I created a test case. For this test case, I used 3 stations. This one in the Netherlands, where sea level is rising very slowly and there's no upwards curvature. There's been no acceleration. And here's one from Italy, which shows the same thing. Very slow sea level rise and no acceleration. And the third graph is from the Philippines. As you can see, something catastrophic happened in the 1960s. The tide gauge went from almost no sea level rise to extremely rapid sea level rise. I don't know what caused this, but this property makes it a good example for this test case. In this graph, I averaged all 3 stations together, and guess what we see? Just like in the 1982 NASA graph, sea level rise slowed down during the 1950s. But since the mid-1960s, the average of our 3 stations shows very rapid sea level rise. I measured the different trends on this graph. Prior to the mid-1960s, our average was about 0.18 millimeters per year, but since then it's about 0.54 millimeters per year. So I've demonstrated a tripling of sea level rise rates, just like NASA shows in their current graphs. And you can see the increase in rise rates very plainly as an upwards curvature in the graph. Or in this case, it was actually more like a break in slope than a smooth curvature. But for the sake of this experiment, it's the same idea. Obviously, what I did in this experiment was scientific nonsense. But I used the same technique which NASA and CSIRO did to create their upwards curvature. I doubt NASA and CSIRO used the same stations which I did, but the point is that by cherry-picking data, you can create any shape curve which you want. Now let's look at the correct way to measure changes in rate of sea level rise. Over large distances, the oceans appear flat because water seeks a level surface. This is exactly the reason why people used to believe the Earth is flat. And some people who are almost as clueless as climate alarmists still do. If a giant iceberg from East Antarctica slipped into the sea, like climate scientists are always trying to scare us about, then we would see a significant rise in sea level everywhere on Earth. All of the oceans are interconnected. This makes it very easy to detect changes in the rate of sea level rise. All you need are a handful of good stations, like the one at the Battery in New York and Lower Manhattan. This tide gauge has been active since the 1850s and shows a steady rate of sea level rise. It shows no upwards curvature, it shows no downwards curvature. In other words, it shows no change in the rate of sea level rise, just as the 1990 IPCC report said. Another good station to use would be the one from Key West, Florida, which also shows no change in the rate of sea level rise. I'm sure Greta would like us to use this one from Stockholm, which shows sea level falling. Sea level isn't actually falling at Stockholm, but the land is rising. But the key point here is that there's no curvature. There's no indication of change of rate of sea level rise or fall. I'll show you a couple more good tide gauges with long-term records. Seattle and Alameda, California in the San Francisco Bay. Neither shows any change in the rate of sea level rise. In order to detect a change in the rate of sea level rise, you would look for an upwards or downwards curvature, and it should be visible at every single station. You don't need hundreds of mediocre stations in order to detect changes in the rate of sea level rise. All you need are a handful of good ones. But if your intent is to try to fool people into believing that sea level rise is accelerating, then you cherry pick stations out of this group in order to create the trend that you want. There's no reason to believe that sea level rise is accelerating. And from history, we know that sea level used to rise much faster. Over the past 20,000 years, sea level has risen about 120 meters or 400 feet. From about 14,000 years ago until 8,000 years ago, sea level rose very fast as the great glaciers of the last ice age melted. But over the past 8,000 years, sea level has been rising very slowly. Climate alarmists want you to believe that this 400 feet of sea level rise was natural, but the last few millimeters were man-made. The ideas which climate alarmists are peddling are complete nonsense, but NASA has given them a huge boost by creating fake graphs for them. It would be interesting to find out who's paying NASA to create these fake graphs and why they're doing it. Barack Obama said that climate skeptics were members of the Flat Earth Society. But the reality is that climate alarmists are doing some of the worst and most fraudulent junk science in history. And their ideas about a climate crisis are no more credible than those of the Flat Earth Society. In 1988, climate alarmists predicted that the Maldives would be underwater within 30 years. Well, it's been 31 years and the Maldives are doing just fine. The great American physicist and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said, "Reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." And an increasing number of people are starting to understand that they are being fooled by fraudsters at government agencies. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. I saw a great headline on Google News this evening. Here's why scientists are working so hard to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. So I pictured a bunch of scientists in white lab coats sitting at Earth's control panel, frantically working to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius, wiping sweat off their brows, knowing that survival of the planet is dependent on them keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius. But meanwhile, back in the real world, in 1986, NASA's James Hansen made his first appearance before Congress. Overheating of Earth poses survival threat. Scientists are warning Congress that the long-theorized, life-threatening overheating of the Earth from man-made air pollution is now a frightening reality. The fact that the greenhouse effect is real is proven, said James Hansen, director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Hansen said the average U.S. temperature has risen from 1 to 2 degrees since 1958 and is predicted to increase an additional 3 or 4 degrees sometime between 2010 and 2020. And all of this is going to happen before the year 2020. So basically, we're looking at 4 to 6 degrees warming in the next 10 weeks. But let's look for a minute at Hansen's claim that the average U.S. temperature has risen 1 to 2 degrees since 1958. Remember that he gave this presentation to Congress in 1986. This is a graph Hansen published of U.S. temperatures in 1999. The left circle shows 1958, and the right circle shows 1986, when Hansen gave his testimony to Congress. Where did Hansen get 1 to 2 degrees warming out of that? It was about 0.1 C. He was off by nearly a factor of 10. And why did he cherry pick 1958 as a start year? Why didn't he start back here in the 1930s? Had he started here in the 1930s, he would have shown nearly half a degree Celsius cooling. Hansen was misrepresenting the past, and he was also misrepresenting the future. When the subsequent warming he predicted didn't happen, he simply changed the data. Shortly after the year 1999, NASA and NOAA changed the U.S. temperature data to create a long-term warming where previously it was a long-term cooling. They made a bunch of excuses for this data tampering and published them in peer-reviewed papers. Nixon called this plausible deniability. This data tampering was necessary to keep the public from learning that James Hansen had no idea what he was talking about. So they took the measured data in blue, they cooled the past and warmed the present to create a warming trend where there isn't any in the actual data. And this graph shows the adjustments that are being made. Temperatures before the year 2005 are cooled progressively more as you go backwards in time, and recent temperatures are being rapidly increased upwards. So scientists aren't working hard to limit warming, they're working hard to create it where it doesn't exist, because their funding depends on it. And the only control knob for temperature which these scientists have is their software, which creates the fake data. And how would scientists control the temperature anyway? They're just sitting in their office playing with computer models. They would be more productive playing Minecraft. And I wish these scientists would send some of their heat-trapping CO2 down here to Colorado, as we're facing record cold in a couple of days. No, scientists aren't working hard to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. What they're actually doing is working hard to make fake graphs to make it look like Earth is warming towards 2 degrees Celsius. Their funding and their prestige depends on it. The people creating these fake graphs are the same climate modelers who made the forecasts of doom originally. They have a conflict of interest. It's like having a Little League team who also serve as the umpires and scorekeepers. I don't think anyone would put up with that. The difference, of course, being that there are actually some good players in Little League. Superstitious people have always wanted to believe that someone else controls the weather and climate. In the 16th century, thousands of witches were burned at the stake for cooking the weather. These Salem witch trials were likely a response to bad weather. But climate alarmists are much more sophisticated now. They know that Republicans cause bad weather, not witches. Fortunately, they have their scientists at the control panel working 24/7 to rescue them. Reality is that climate modelers are not working to keep temperatures down. They're doing everything they can to create the appearance of a lot of warming. They have no interest or motivation to end the climate crisis scam. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The weather has turned, and it's time for climate alarmists to change their focus from heat waves to snow and cold. Almost 20 years ago, Dr. David Viner at the Climatic Research Unit in England announced that children just aren't going to know what snow is. Let's look at how he did with that forecast. Well, it's now October, and we're getting record snow in many parts of the world. This is the 8th October in a row with above average snow cover in the Northern Hemisphere and the 16th year out of the last 20. Autumn snow cover has been increasing in the Northern Hemisphere for the past 50 years, with recent years being the snowiest on record. And a very similar story for winter snow cover. It's also been increasing for 50 years. I live in Boulder, Colorado, which is a hotbed for climate research. We have the National Center for Atmospheric Research, the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and NOAA. And there's huge amounts of other climate research going on at the University of Colorado and at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. The forecast for Thursday, October 10th is looking very interesting here. It will be the earliest date on record which Boulder failed to get above freezing. The previous record was October 11th, 2009. It will also be the second year in a row which we had record cold on October 10th. And we're expecting about 5 inches of snow. Since atmospheric CO2 levels hit 350 parts per million in 1988, October 10th temperatures in Boulder have declined more than 10 degrees. And it was also our shortest summer on record. I took this picture on the first day of summer in the mountains west of Boulder. It looked a lot more like Christmas than like the summer solstice. You would think that the climate scientists here in Boulder might take notice of what's going on outside their window, but they are rather too busy with their climate models to notice what's going on in the real world. Last month, Montana was hit with an unprecedented 4 feet of snow. I'm pretty sure that Dr. David Viner's forecast from 20 years ago was wrong. Now let's look at the long history of nonsense being spread by climate alarmists about winter and snow. Snow is the white elephant in the room. In 2006, the New York Times announced the endless summer. It's not that I don't like 60-degree days and eating fresh spinach right out of my garden in December, but the extended growing season is one of the signs of global warming. It goes hand in hand with polar bears dying in the Arctic. A year later, the New York Times declared that it's now impossible to ski because there's no snow. In 2012, the New York Times again announced the endless summer. And in 2014, the New York Times announced the end of snow. In 2012, the Washington Post predicted cherry blossoms blooming in February and starting their bloom process in January. And this was Washington 3 years later on March 7th. Washington climate expert Andy Weiss told me it was probably the first time the Potomac was frozen in March since the 18th century. I took the dogs for a walk that day on frozen Chesapeake Bay. It's kind of cool to know that we were the first to do that in March since the 18th century. And last year, the first week of January was the coldest on record in the northeastern United States, so there probably weren't too many cherry trees starting their blooming process. I took this picture of the cherry trees in the frozen tidal basin on January 8th of last year. Since carbon dioxide hit 350 parts per million in 1988, the trend for peak bloom date in Washington, D.C. has gotten about 2 days later. Over the past 100 years, March temperatures in the states surrounding Washington, D.C. have declined slightly. March in recent years have been among the coldest on record. The warmest month of March in the Washington, D.C. area was 1921. And if you remember yesterday, I released a video about how NOAA has erased the heat of 1921. Two other very warm Marches were 1945 and 1946. 1946 was a very interesting year because they had an early bloom and the cherry trees bloomed again in November. March 15th, 1946, the cherry trees around the tidal basin are showing their first blooms, somewhat to the surprise of park officials who hadn't expected them for another week. And then again on November 1st, 1946, the capital's famed cherry trees popped forth surprise blooms and roses bloomed along the Potomac Friday after a record 2-day heat wave that saw mercury reach 84 degrees. Imagine the hysteria among climate alarmists if we had a year like 1946 again now. Climate alarmists aren't doing too well with their winter forecasts. 6 of the 10 largest snowstorms to hit New York City have occurred in the past decade. And in the middle of this, the New York Times announced the end of snow. But being wrong 100% of the time is not a problem for climate alarmists. They simply rewrite history. Here's an article from the BBC in 2016. Will snow become a thing of the past as the climate warms? New York and Washington, D.C. have just been smothered by another massive snowstorm, which seems strange when you remember that the world is getting hotter. And then at the bottom of the article, the BBC says, the real answer is rather surprising. Extreme snowfall is actually an expected consequence of a warmer world. So when they said children just aren't going to know what snow is, what they really meant was that extreme snowfall was going to become commonplace. In the 2001 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, they said, milder winter temperatures will decrease heavy snowstorms, which is the exact opposite of what climate alarmists are trying to say they predicted all along. And the New York Times has been intermittently doing this for decades. In 1996, they blamed global warming for the blizzard, which apparently is the same as no snow at the New York Times. But we all know that being a climate alarmist means never having to say you're sorry. In 2010, the New York Times said, bundle up, it's global warming. The overall warming of the atmosphere is actually creating cold weather extremes. That was right in between when they announced the endless summer in 2006 and in 2012. Whatever the current weather is, they say this is the trend and that they predicted it all along. Now let's look at one of my favorite topics, which is ski forecasts. In 2009, Alex Hill, the chief government advisor with the Met Office, told the Scotsman there was no future for skiing in Scotland because climate change would see winters become too warm for regular snowfall. And less than a year later, Scottish ski resorts had to shut down because they had too much snow. The organization Save Our Snow has on their front page, woman achieves 10 years of monthly Scottish skiing despite climate change. Last year, the New York Times announced that it was going to get too hot for the Winter Olympics. And on February 9th last year, Alternet said, Winter Olympics threatened by global warming, but NBC won't acknowledge it. That was one day after it was reported that the 2018 Winter Olympics opening ceremony could be the coldest ever. The 1932 Winter Olympics were held at Lake Placid, New York, and almost had to be canceled because they didn't have any snow a week before the Olympics started. New York City was having record heat during the weeks prior to the 1932 Winter Olympics. New York, January 15, 1932. With a high temperature of 66 degrees at 4 p.m. today, New York enjoyed the third successive day of record January warm weather. Well, things have changed at Lake Placid, and they've been having record snowfall in recent years. And the same story on the West Coast. The 3 snowiest years on record at Squaw Valley, California were 2011, 2017, and this past season. This is the exact opposite of what climate alarmists predicted. Los Angeles Times, June 2001. Less snowfall could spell big problems for California. New scientific research suggests that global warming, even by what experts consider conservative estimates, will severely shrink the Sierra snowpack. Top climate fraudster Catherine Hale from Texas Tech University said, if we continue our addiction to fossil fuels, 70 to 90% of the actual snow on the ground in the California Sierras could be gone by the end of this century. They were still skiing in California in August this year. Last year, the federal government was warning about dwindling Sierra snowpack in between the 2 record years of 2017 and 2019. Climate alarmists can't even get their history right. This is an article from 2006. 46 years ago this month, the world's athletes frolicked in the snow at the 1960 Winter Olympics in Squaw Valley, California. Actually, what happened at Squaw Valley in 1960 is that they almost had to cancel the Olympics because of a lack of snow. 9th of February 1960, change to snow saves California Olympic site. Squaw Valley, California, rain turned to snow just in time to avert possible disaster at the Winter Olympic Games. New England states were offering to take the Winter Olympics if they weren't able to ski in California. But things are much better at Squaw Valley now. Their 3 heaviest snow years all occurred in the past decade. Never mind that they've been wrong about everything in the past and that they switch their story every few months. The New York Times says the end is near and we only have 12 years left for the planet. If climate alarmists are worried about skiing, they can always ski in southern Arizona. I took this picture on New Year's Day. And a few weeks later, Arizona had another large snowstorm, which turned out to be the snowiest day on record in Arizona. Arizona had their longest ski season ever this year, with skiers at Flagstaff skiing until the middle of May. I took this picture at Los Alamos, New Mexico during Christmas week last year. The snow got deeper and deeper over the next few weeks and ended up being one of the snowiest months on record in New Mexico. And I took this picture of fresh snow in the mountains of New Mexico in June this year. Heavy snow like that in June in New Mexico is pretty unusual. So let's look at how climate alarmists responded to the record snow in Montana last month. Chuck Bell, the NBC meteorologist at Washington, D.C., said, one of the atmospheric response to radical heat in the east is record snow in the west. It's all part of our changing climate. So I spent about 30 seconds fact-checking Chuck, and I sent him this article. September 22nd, 1895, snow in the west, hot in the east. Snow in Dakota, Montana, and Colorado, different in the east. According to the official record today, it was the hottest day of the year, with the thermometer touching 97 degrees in New York. Springfield, Massachusetts, September 21st, the thermometer registered 105 degrees here today. Brattleboro, Massachusetts, September 21st, 1895. This was the hottest day of the season. The thermometer reached 105 degrees. Rawlins, Wyoming. A heavy northeast snowstorm began early this morning. It's now 8 inches deep and still snowing. There are some fears for sheep still in the mountains. If it should turn cold, there will be heavy losses. Chuck Bell apparently believes that a similar weather pattern to 1895 is an indication that the climate has changed. Could you imagine what Chuck Bell would say if it had 105 degrees in Massachusetts on September 21st now? Climate alarmists are all over the map. They don't know the past, they don't know the present, they don't know the future. And when they're wrong, they're unable to admit it. There's no reason to take the New York Times or other climate alarmists seriously. We don't have any need for Monty Python's Flying Circus anymore because we have the New York Times, Washington Post, and Chuck Bell. And happy skiing in what looks like it could be another great winter. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Eller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Some guy named Malin Baker took it on himself to debunk me on YouTube. His video is very long, but I'm just going to show you the first segment.
Because nobody wants fraud going on. He starts by focusing on the National Climate Assessment for the US, Basically, it contained a bunch of graphs that seriously annoyed him. One of his arguments is that the data sequence for related graphs has been carefully selected to show the picture the dreadful alarmists want to show. Well, that's perfectly feasible. It's a well-known technique. In fact, Heller says it's a well-known technique used by the alarmists. However, as you'll know if you've seen the debate videos between him and Potholer54, linked below, it's a technique he's not always been averse to using himself. Anyway, let's hear the case for the prosecution from his latest video.
First, let's look at the heatwave graph, which starts in 1960. They carefully picked a period during the global cooling scare to start their graph so that they could show heat waves increasing over time. And here's the underlying data from the part of the National Climate Assessment which didn't go out to journalists and politicians. This graph is warm spells days, this one is heat wave magnitude, and this one is warmest temperature of the year. As you can see, summers were much hotter in the United States prior to 1960. So by hiding all the data before 1960, they were able to show a little bit of an upwards trend. I overlaid the part of the graph which went out to policymakers over here in this corner on top of the underlying data, and you can see exactly what they did.
So here we're talking about heat waves, and he's correctly pointing out that the graph going back to the 1900s shows a much bigger spike before the period of the graph used in the climate change document. And if you took that spike out, you'd say it was pretty much flat. Maybe a bit of a push upwards right at the end, but too short a period to make a trend. It's worth noting what that spike actually is. It is, of course, the great dust bowl of the 1930s. If you glance at the scientific literature about that period, we still don't conclusively understand all of the factors that led to the awful conditions that blighted so many lives. But it's believed to have been made more intense by the poor farming methods that were being used at the time, which displaced deep-rooted grasses that would trap moisture. And that would explain why it hasn't happened since. But we certainly don't know conclusively whether that was the case. In any case, it seems pretty clear that it's something of an extraordinary anomaly. But even if you don't have that, you still end up with a fairly flat picture, which seems to support Heller's case. But this is just one of a number of related graphs. And this one uses a composite rating called a heat wave index, which is calculated, determined by what percentage of the country experienced how many heat waves. And like any composite figure, it's not always obvious exactly what story it's telling.
Mellon pulled a bait and switch. That's not the graph I was using in my video. That's a different one from the EPA. The graphs I was using were from the National Climate Assessment, but they were hidden in the final document. The URLs are written right at the bottom of the slide. The final document, which went out to policymakers, intentionally hid the underlying data from the National Climate Assessment. Mellon is trying to change the subject away from the fact that the people who put out the document intentionally hid their own data. But let's move on to the rest of his argument, where he says it was just a very narrow spike and was caused by farmers. It wasn't a narrow spike. Temperatures were elevated for 40 years. The Dust Bowl years were just a few years during the 1930s, but the heat started long before that. This graph shows the percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations going back to the year 1900. You can see that the period from 1910 through the 1950s had a lot more hot days, long before the Dust Bowl started. Now let's look at Mellon's claim that farmers caused the Dust Bowl. There was a worldwide drought in 1934. This article from June 1934 was written by the chief meteorologist of the U.S. Weather Bureau. Worldwide drought is seen likely. Weatherman admits there's something wrong and that no one knows why. What is wrong with the world's weather is a question I've been asked many times in the last few weeks. Here's an article from Australia, June 4th, 1934. World drought, farmers' ruinous losses, almost universal disaster. Europe revives pagan rites. Here's one from England in 1934. Drought in England. England has just experienced the worst drought for nearly 100 years. Here's another one from Australia, June 1934. Worldwide drought. Drought in wheat-producing countries of 3 continents threatens a food shortage. This map shows the actual Dust Bowl area. It's a pretty small area centered around the Oklahoma Panhandle. So the farmers in this region caused a worldwide drought? That theory is complete nonsense. 80% of the United States was in drought. These farmers were victims of the drought. Bad farming practices may have aggravated the dust, but they didn't cause the drought. And they certainly didn't cause the unprecedented heat, which went all over the country. Mellon is talking complete gibberish. Here's an article from 1998. Records stored by nature in the bottoms of lakes and the growth rings of ancient trees show that in the late 1300s and again in the late 1500s, withering megadroughts lasting at least 25 years descended on western North America. Sand dunes rolled across much of the Great Plains and can be found beneath now fertile topsoil in some areas. And Sierra Nevada mountain lakes that today provide water for much of California dried up completely. The two scientists pointed out that droughts 400 and 600 years ago had nothing to do with human-induced global warming. Let's read this again. Sand dunes rolled across much of the Great Plains. Dust bowls happen. They're not caused by farmers. The bottom line is that summers were much hotter in the United States from the 1910s through the 1940s, and that the National Climate Assessment final document hid their own data. This black line is not somebody else's data. It is the underlying data from the National Climate Assessment, which is being hidden. And farmers in the Oklahoma Panhandle did not cause the worldwide drought. And carbon dioxide did not cause the mega droughts in the 1300s and the 1500s. Can we get back to doing science, please? And before I finish up, let's look at some more historical heat waves. The history of the world's droughts goes back to the year 627, when in France and Germany, thousands of human beings died of thirst. In the year 1000, the rivers of Europe dried up, and heaps of fish were left to putrefy and spread the plague that followed. In 1123, the Rhine River dried up in Alsace. During the Battle of Bella in 1260, more men died from heat than wounds. In 1303 and 1304, the Rhine, the Loire, and Seine rivers ran dry. In 1779, many persons in Bologna were stifled. Shops all over Europe were closed for months. In 1821, a plague of mice came with intolerable heat. More than 200,000 persons died from heat in France. Mellon seems like a nice enough guy. I'm going to ask him respectfully to quit spreading superstition and join me in spreading the truth. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.
Those dirty, filthy white motherfuckers breaking our planet. I should have known. They have streets. Okay? Has nothing to do.
Até amanhã vais ter que ver os vídeos, ok, mãe?
Hello, this is Tony Heller from Real
Ok.
What's going on, everyone? Jeremy here.
Hey everybody, we're going to be going full Alex Jones mode on this German synagogue shooting here. Now, just to get this out of the way, obviously, right off the bat, can this situation be legit? Can it be exactly how
Is
the
Nintendo
mainstream
planning on-
media is presenting it, where you have a literal neo-Nazi out there attacking a Jewish synagogue? Sure. I think that there are real neo-Nazis out there. But, and a huge but, is every single white person out there a neo-Nazi? Is every single white person out there suffering from racial bias and hates all of the browns peoples and the black people and the Lamans and the Jews and the Muslims? No. And that's what the left media establishment, that's a mainstream.
Here from the quartering, and Batwoman reviews are in, and it's not good. It's sitting at currently an 8% on Rotten Tomatoes, and an even lower, well, it's actually not lower, 3.2 out of 10, or 32% on IMDb, which means it's time for the media to come out and blame it on the trolls. And that's exactly what Paul Tassi is doing here. Paul is capable of some really good articles, and then he's also capable of complete trash like this. Look,
What's
That
up,
woman
guys?
shows
RGT85
for
feels a little bit more responsive than Resident Evil 4, and
it is not good. This statement from, but it isn't as cringy as I expected. It's just, it's like the low budget Arrowverse kind of shows. If you can get past that and get into, you know, some immersion there with them shows like Arrow and these shows, they have good qualities. Batwoman probably won't have many.
Hello, this is Tony Heller from Real Climb.
It's not horrible. I guess that's just one episode in. However, today, in sadly not surprising news, in the wake of its debut past Sunday, the newest edition of the Arrowverse, the CW's Batwoman, is currently getting roasted by quote-unquote fans on IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes after just one episode. It's funny that Paul obviously can't possibly know exactly what people's intentions are. They don't know.
Well, I hope you know what you're doing.
May I ask? Last name. Did you see them? I don't want to play anymore.
That they haven't seen the show. It'll be perfect when it fits a woman. There's all sorts of 44 reviews on IMDb.
Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. After I made my last video, I remembered one more computer modeling project I did way back in 1974, at the peak of the global cooling scare. That was an interesting project, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to talk a little bit about consensus science. 30 years ago, the United Nations announced that if we didn't solve global warming by the year 2000, entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth. June 30th, 1989, grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos, said Brown, director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program. He said governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. So apparently the world ended before Greta was born, but it's much worse than that. In 1974, the United Nations Secretary General Kurt Waldheim said we only had a few months to save the planet from global cooling. He said if sufficient action isn't taken in the next few months, countries could disappear from the face of the earth. April 2nd to 8th, 1974. The UN must have an official playbook with the words, countries could disappear from the face of the earth. And it's right there in Australia's Communist Weekly newspaper. That sounds really bad, but it gets even worse. Experts said that America would have water rationing by 1974 and food rationing by 1980. Here's a very serious article from 1974. San Francisco, imagine this global scenario. A devastating once-in-a-century drought sweeps across the Soviet Union, resulting in the most disastrous wheat crop failure in recent Russian history. Several thousand miles away, the cold surface waters of the Humboldt Current off the Pacific coast of South America temporarily disappear, virtually destroying Peru's anchovy fishery and setting off a worldwide shortage in poultry feed and raising the price of chicken in the United States. In India and much of Southeast Asia, the all-important monsoon season come 3 weeks late. As a result, the rice harvest is only half the normal level. And in Africa, the Sahara Desert shifts southward, causing widespread famine, uncounted deaths, and migration of more than 13 million persons. These climate-induced disasters are not, of course, imaginary. All took place during the summer of 1972, and their effects are still being felt around the world. To consider some of the urgent questions that a changing climate poses for the world, several of America's most prominent meteorologists gathered here last week for discussions at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. What emerged was a grim forecast for the future. It was generally agreed that the extraordinary warmth of the early 20th century is drawing to a close and that a global cooling trend has been underway since about 1940. But the scientists cannot explain why. So look at all those horrible disasters which global cooling caused. Same story in Time magazine, June 24th, 1974. Another ice age. In Africa, drought continues for the 6th consecutive year, adding terribly to the toll of famine victims. During 1972, record rains in parts of the U.S., Pakistan, and Japan caused some of the worst flooding in centuries. Telltale signs are everywhere, from the unexpected persistence and thickness of pack ice in the waters around Iceland to the southward migration of a warm-living creature like the armadillo from the Midwest. Since the 1940s, the mean global temperature has dropped about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Chicago Tribune, March 2nd, 1975. New ice age on way soon? In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. Many climatologists see these signs as evidence that a significant shift in climate is taking place, a shift that could be the forerunner of an ice age like that which gripped much of the northern hemisphere before retreating 10,000 years ago. The cover of Science News, March 1st, 1975, The Ice Age Cometh, Glaciers Plowing Through Manhattan. Nothing steals your childhood like a glacier plowing through your living room. Des Moines Sunday Register, July 21st, 1974, World is getting cooler. And there was the graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research showing temperatures plummeting since the 1940s. That's what global temperature graphs look like before Michael Mann and NASA rewrote the world's history during the 1990s. And there was unanimous consensus. New York Times, January 30th, 1961. Scientists agree world is colder. An assembly of specialists from several continents seems to have reached unanimous agreement on only one point. It's getting colder. March 11th, 1979. One thing is indisputable. The world's been cooling off since World War II. But no worries, the scientists were on top of this. They had a solution to global cooling. They were just going to put soot on the Arctic ice cap and melt it. I was experiencing global cooling in Arizona in 1974. I was a freshman at Arizona State University and playing on the soccer team. It was a little bit warm that year. Phoenix had 18 consecutive days over 110 degrees, and nearby Buckeye had 21 consecutive days, which was a record for both places. We held soccer practice every afternoon outdoors at 3 o'clock, no matter what the temperature was, and most days it was over 105 degrees. The 1974 heat wave wasn't Arizona's record, though, for days over 110 degrees. That actually occurred in 1929, when Parker had 24 consecutive days above 110 degrees. And Arizona's longest stretch over 120 degrees occurred twice, once in 1896 and once in 1905. Both times they had 7 consecutive days over 120 degrees. But now let's go to the computer modeling project I was doing at Arizona State in 1974. Prior to the 1970s, golf balls looked like this. They had dimples and straight lines. But if you look at golf balls now, they have a beehive pattern with no straight lines. And there's a reason for that. With the old-style golf balls, sometimes the ball would behave like a knuckleball. In order for a golf ball to fly stably, the dimples have to create turbulence around the ball. And if the ball was spinning parallel to these straight lines, there'd be regions where it was smooth and there was no turbulence being created. Thus, your golf ball would sometimes do crazy things and behave more like a knuckleball thrown by a pitcher than what a golf ball flight's supposed to look like. So I worked with a physicist from Los Alamos, and for my final project at ASU that semester, I modeled the flight of golf balls. Well, I love computers, but I didn't major in computer science because my brother was doing that and I didn't want to follow in his footsteps. So I went into geology instead, where I learned about consensus science. In 1929, Alfred Wegener published these maps. They showed the position of the continents at previous times in Earth's history. He was the first person to present the theory that continents moved. Any geologist who's paying the slightest bit of attention should have been aware of the fact that land moves. You can actually see the land moving in places like Hollister, California. So let's look at how the consensus dealt with Wegener's hypothesis. Utter damned rot, said the president of the prestigious American Philosophical Society. If we are to believe this hypothesis, we must forget everything we've learned in the last 70 years and start all over again, said another American scientist. Anyone who valued his reputation for scientific sanity would never dare support such a theory, said a British geologist. Thus did most in the scientific community ridicule the concept that would revolutionize the earth sciences and revile the man who dared to propose it. German meteorological pioneer and polar explorer Alfred Wegener. Science historians compare his story with the tribulations of Galileo. My professor at Arizona State University, Bob Dietz, was the guy who ended up finally breaking the consensus down. 50 or 60 years after Wegener proposed his obviously correct theory, the scientific consensus finally accepted it. Now let's talk about another consensus in Arizona. Percival Lowell was a wealthy Massachusetts businessman who decided to set up an observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. That's where the planet Pluto was discovered before the scientific consensus erased Pluto as a planet. Lowell spent many hours staring through his telescope at Mars and determined that there were canals up there. Sunday morning, January 20th, 1901, a few days ago, a startling announcement was made to the effect that Professor A.E. Douglas of the Flagstaff Observatory, Arizona, had received a message from Mars. And Tesla, the guy who Tesla cars is named after, was actually talking to the Martians. By 1909, the New York Times and leading astronomers had determined that the canals were there for drainage. And over the next 2 years, the New York Times watched the Martians doing vast engineering projects, building 2 immense canals. By early October, 100 years ago, the fact that the Martian canals exist is no longer doubted even by the most religious astronomer. No one doubts today that these canals are parts of an enormous irrigation system which supplies water to the desert inlands. But apparently there was still one doubter left, because in 1927, the New York Times reported that he finally agreed that there was life on Mars. And in 1996, around the time they were rewriting the temperature record, NASA was still saying that there was life on Mars. And in 1998, the year when Michael Mann published his hockey stick graph, NASA was still sticking to the life on Mars story. So we should ask, what happened to the consensus science of life on Mars? Well, obviously the Martians were wiped out by global warming. So now I want to finish up with a discussion of my stolen childhood and political correctness. I survived the heat of 1974, but one thing which didn't survive was my fraternity house. New Fraternity Row was the life of the campus back in 1974. There'd be bands down there every Friday and Saturday night. We had an incredibly fun time. But fraternities are politically incorrect, so a couple of years ago, the university tore the houses down. I was just a few months older than Greta Thunberg when I started college, but I wasn't off trying to save the planet. I was there to get an education and have fun like a 17-year-old should be doing. I don't have any doubt that Greta Thunberg's childhood has been stolen, but it isn't by the climate, it's by the unscrupulous adults which surround her. Children should be out having fun. They shouldn't have adults telling them that they have to save the planet. The way we survived the heat of 1974 in Phoenix is we'd go out on the river tubing, and we'd bring a tube full of beer, and we'd have a great time. And that's how I survived my stolen childhood, having fun. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com, because we're pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.
A lot of people in the alternative media are pointing out that free speech is constantly shrinking. While a lot of people in the alternative media are pointing out that free speech is constantly shrinking, while hate speech is constantly growing. To the point where if you have archives of things that used to be said on gaming forums and internet websites 4 years ago, you will notice that things that were perfectly acceptable in the past are definitely not acceptable now. And you notice this with politicians, like my video with Trudeau is still coming, but basically when Trudeau put on the blackface, no one complained. Like there was no uproar, none of the people that went to the party had anything to
The New York Times produced this article only a few days ago, How to Develop an Appetite .
Greta, I saw your presentation at COP24, and it was compelling, but I respectfully dispute your statements. A child is a miracle, Greta. A child should be able to live in joy, entranced by the wonder of the world, not in fear of the future or hatred of their elders. Big climate is a $1.5 trillion global industry. Greta, it's all built on a faulty premise that carbon dioxide is like a control knob on climate. But science has shown that that is not true. Your ancestor, Svante Arrhenius, not only developed the hothouse theory of catastrophic global warming, he also amended his catastrophic view. In 1906, in this paper, he wrote in German. He decided that warming would be perhaps around 1.5 degrees Celsius and beneficial. So when people tell you that the world only has 12 years left, they're telling you science fiction, not science fact. Those scary predictions come from computer simulations that are based on a worst case scenario. And you have so far removed from reality. Many scientists are angry that people are being scared and fooled in this way. These foreign climate has become a big green business. That's who's greedy and uncaring. Big Green doesn't mind if poor people become poorer from heat or eat poverty. They just want the subsidies and the carbon credits. Let them eat carbon. You said we adults have done nothing. That's not true. What amazing advances we've made in this world. People
I don't want to shoot you. Fine. Don't shoot me. Mind if I shoot you?
The script for Gemini Man has been floating around Hollywood for 22 years. It's seen huge stars attached, including Harrison Ford, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, and even...
ClimateScience.com, setting the records.
If you want to hang out with myself and Mrs. Salty, we're going to be doing a live stream, 5:30 Pacific time later on today. If you want to come out, it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be making fun of all these lefty assholes. But for now, let's just focus on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for a second, because all of a sudden, this chick is all for war. Take a look at this. We're over at Infowars.com. Flip-flop. AOC suddenly thinks pulling out of Syria is a terrible idea. Trump derangement syndrome on full display. And so Reddit did a good job putting a side-by-side of this chick's opinions that have changed over the last few months, by the way. Take a look at this over at Business Insider on April 3rd, 2019. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rand Paul, and Elon Brotherfucker Omar, and a bipartisan group of lawmakers sent a letter to Trump urging the president to remove U.S. troops from Syria. And then on the other side, October 8th, 2019, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez learns to love war, blasts Trump's Syria withdrawal. And so, of course, what we're looking at is an instance of Orange Man's doing something. I'm against it. It doesn't matter what it is. I'm against it because Orange Man literally Nazi. This dude could save a cat from a burning tree, and these lefties out there would still find a way to shit on the guy for doing it. And this is a perfect example of this type of numbnuts over here. And you lefties, how come none of you question this AOC chick? How come you don't sit there and say, listen, AOC has a completely blank resume except for a small stint at an Applebee's bar, but yet she knows so much about everything, right? This chick wants to fundamentally change the healthcare system in this country. The healthcare system, by the way, is 17% of the world's largest economy. So if you want to fundamentally change that system, you better know some shit. And then on top of that, she knows everything about the flow of immigration and the migrants and how that works within the economy. She wants to give free welfare to illegal aliens and open up our borders. She knows everything about the climate sciences, right? All of the buildings in the future must be built in a way to fit with the Green New Deal. Plus, get rid of airplanes because.
Hey guys, so before we start today's video, I just want to.
And here you can see, apparently, she's also got a PhD in diplomatic Middle East affairs, apparently, and knows that if we pull out of Syria, all shit's going to break loose. No, you numbnuts on the left. This chick's stupid. She doesn't know anything. She's not this smart. Nobody should be listening to her. In fact, you should be having the knee-jerk reaction that you guys have for Trump with this idiot. Whatever Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says, run in the opposite direction. Right? She doesn't have a track record of doing or knowing anything. But yet, all of you idiots on the left seem to want to heap praise upon her. Fascinating how that works. Well, let's go take a look at her tweet. Trump's sudden withdrawal from the northern Syria and endorsement of Turkey's actions could have catastrophic consequences and risks laying the ground for immense violence and suffering. We can pursue a strategy to stop our endless wars without endangering the lives of innocent peoples. I like that first sentence up there. Trump's sudden withdrawal. He ran on a platform of pulling us out of these endless wars. He ran on a platform saying, we're getting out of Syria. We shouldn't be in Syria in the first place. And he was talking about that in 2016. Right? You can't run around in 2019 and say, it's a knee-jerk reaction. He's suddenly going to pull us out for no reason. No, he ran on pulling us out of this place. You can't pretend that you're surprised by this. And by the way, for somebody who's supposedly so concerned about the climate, ooh, you guys and your hamburgers, your plastic straws, ooh, you're racist, you're going to kill the planet in 12 years. Why don't you care that in order to support Syria, we have to fly personnel and resources on gigantic planes that are running off of, surprise, not electricity. These aren't solar-powered airplanes. We're flying them to the other side of the planet. And why don't you care about that? Why isn't that a big deal? Shouldn't you be like, yeah, let's end all of these wars in the Middle East so we're not flying things to those places and then blowing people up? I mean, aren't you concerned about climate justice? We're using those resources to blow up poor, impoverished brown people in other countries. I would imagine if you're going to spout off about racial justice due to climate change in this country, you would be all for ending all of this, but no, of course not. Orange man bad. So let's keep all of that there. Keep that military-industrial complex over there, killing all of those people, blowing stuff up. totally fine with you. You guys are absolute numbnuts. I like how you put all of this energy and effort into supporting Syria and Turkey's border, thousands and thousands of miles away. But if you want your border supported in this country, I guess you could go get bent. You lefties are such scumbags. But anyway, boys, there you have it. Some more lefty hypocrisy. All of a sudden, the Democrat Party is the pro-war party. George Bush would be proud of you guys, I guess, at this point. So, boys, thanks so much for watching the video, supporting the channel. If you're interested in more content covering these hypocrites, make sure you hit that subscribe button. All right, guys, take care. Bye.